Hi everyone, welcome. We're so happy that you're here. My name is Maeve Atkinson. I'm the Education Engagement Manager here, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the MAK Center for Art and Architecture and the beautiful Schindler House today. The MAK Center is a contemporary, experimental, multidisciplinary center for art and architecture, headquartered in 3 architectural landmarks, all designed by the Austrian-American architect Rudolf Schindler. We offer year-round schedule of exhibitions and events, presenting programming that challenges conventional notions of architectural space and relationships between the creative arts. Today, we are pleased to present A Permeable Atlas, a conversation with Pablo Castillo Luna, who is our researcher in residence, which marks the culmination of his residency at the MAK Center's Fitzpatrick-Leland house, and presents his ongoing research project called A Permeable Atlas. Researcher in Residence is a collaboration initiative by the MAK Center and the SOM Foundation to provide space and time for rigorous work that addresses pressing issues related to the built environment. Following his presentation, Pablo will be joined by Anna Neimark in conversation. Unfortunately, John May was supposed to be here today, but unfortunately something came up, so we'll miss him today, but looking forward to this conversation. Pablo Castillo Luna is a Canary Island-born architect and educator who teaches at Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning. He holds a master's in architecture from Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he graduated with distinction and received the Architecture Faculty Design Award. He received a diploma in architecture from the University of Las Palmas de Gran Canaria. His work has been exhibited at the Harvard Arts First Festival and the Center for Architecture, and published in Pigden, Paprika, and Atelier. Prior to Cornell, he taught at the Rhode Island School of Design and Wentworth Institute of Technology. His practice is dedicated to design, research, and cultural production. Castillo Luna has led an award-winning projects honored by the Spanish Biennial of Architecture and Urbanism and the Future Architecture Platform. Anna Neimark co-founded First Office Architecture with collaborator Andrew Atwood to promote an exchange of ideas between the academy and the profession. Her research in techniques and representation, formal principles, and precedent analysis has been published widely in journals such as AD, Log, Corian, and Future Interior, as well as the treatise book 9 Essays, co-authored with Atwood. First Office has engaged with projects with the MAK Center for Art and Architecture, the Chicago Biennial Architecture Design Museum in Los Angeles, and the Venice Biennial, and was awarded numerous honors for its creative endeavors, including the Young Architects New York League Prize and the Architects Newspaper's Best of Young Architects Award, and the nomination as a finalist in the MoMA PS1 Young Architects Program. The collaboration recently completed several residential projects and developed a series of accessory dwelling units for the City of LA's ADU pilot program using prefab structural insulated panels. Prior to moving to Los Angeles, Neimark worked at the Office for Metropolitan Architecture in Rotterdam and New York and at the Johnstone Mark Lee in Los Angeles. She is a design faculty and the visual arts coordinator at SCI-Arc. And now we'll pass it over to Pablo.
Thank you, May, for the introduction, and thank you to the MAK Center and to the SOM Foundation for the incredible support during this 5-week residency. So today I'll present A Permeable Atlas, which is the work I've been developing over the past 5 weeks here. And then very grateful to be in conversation with Anna Neimark. Leaking is refusing the illusion of autonomy and control. Architecture has long positioned itself as a machine for dryness. It builds walls, seals joints, layers, and membranes. It erects barriers, all in an effort to keep water out. Yet water does not adhere to these boundaries. It seeps, condenses, erodes, and dissolves. It moves through materials, landscapes, and bodies and infrastructures. A leak is the acknowledgement that buildings and bodies are dependent on larger systems of circulation. Here in this project, I approach water as a connective element that threads places, objects, and histories all together, challenging the fiction of self-contained subjects. Ironically, or perhaps because of it, the project starts with an island as a seemingly isolated territory, but surrounded by water. The archipelago in question was my birthplace, the Canary Islands in Spain, which allows me to think with water through a territory that has always negotiated a layered, shifting and contradictory relationship with it. from narratives of hedonistic pleasure to a contested resource, and from mundane luxury to an element of uneven power, water is very present in all its contradictory meanings in the island's imaginary. For this reason, I turned to the island of Lanzarote, which is situated only 80 miles from the Sahara Desert, as we can see in this old map, a place shaped by a long and complex relationship with water, accentuated by its arid climate and also by tourism. Rather than offering a definitive answer or solution, the project seeks to situate that complexity and to hold it up for reflection. At the same time, it gestures towards the possibility of rethinking our relationship with water, and it hopes to also invite for that conversation. So the project extends the autonomy of the island and into multiple fragments that span across the ocean all the way to California, the Caribbean, and back to the archipelago. So I also want to situate myself in this back and forth across continents between California and the Canary Islands. The bureaucratic impossibility of traveling to the island brought with it an additional layer to the project. The sense of longing drew me to imagining and thinking the island from and in California, establishing connections between the archival materials and personal memories. And of course, it also gave way to the possibility of collaborating and seeing the island through the lens of others. So although the project was carried out here, I was very lucky to count on the help with people in Gran Canaria, Lanzarote, in Boston, Mexico, California, and Ohio. I will show partial accounts through the lens of colleagues, collaborators, and archival materials that construct this atlas. The choice of the word atlas for the title of the project is a deliberate one. Instead of the atlas in its heroic meaning of collecting all territories by means of drawing, my approach is perhaps closer to the Italian photographer Luigi Ghirri, a collection of partial fragments that, by focusing on the cultural meaning of the media at hand, constructs an alternative narrative of the territory it tries to represent. So I'll present the research project still in progress that I've been carrying out over the past 5 weeks with the support of the SOM Foundation and the MAK Center. And I'll show fragments of stories that I want to present here more or less cohesively, following a series of 7 elements that are tangentially related to architecture. These are the myth, the furniture, the model, the image, the pipe, the button, and the brake. In the 1860s, amid a severe drought in Lanzarote, a wooden statue of Christ washed ashore La Caleta del Riadero in Guatiza and was rescued by a shepherd. The figure was likely part of a religious cargo bound for the Americas, as it resembled the features of those made in Seville that were normally shipped over. Shortly after it arrived, rain returned to the island. In the words of Juan Brito, a neighbor of Guatiza, just a few days after the statue became a guest of that family of shepherds, the weather began to change. Water-laden clouds covered the skies of the island, and heavy rains began to fall over the parched fields of Lanzarote. And so it continued until even the last drop of that liquid gold mixed with earth overflowed. Since the statue was brought by seawater and brought rainwater to the island, it became known as El Cristo de las Aguas, or the Christ of the Waters, and its arrivals on the shores of Lanzarote is celebrated yearly to this day. The estiladeras are a testament to the permeable boundaries from the microscopic scale of its pores to transatlantic relationships, from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean. La destiladera is a domestic filtration device traditionally used in Canarias that uses the natural porosity of the stone to filter and cool drinking water. Once placed in a specifically designed wooden stand, the stone is suspended above a clay vessel and becomes an integral part of the home's furniture. Water is poured into the hollow rock that we can see above in the GIF, slowly seeping through its porous body and dripping into the clay container below. As it passes through, the water is filtered, nurturing el culantrillo, which is a type of plant that would grow under the humid rock, helping with the water temperature. Also, it is said that the mud that's formed under the culantrillo was a healing remedy for the lips. The outer surfaces of the clay vessels sweat in contact with air, helping to keep the water cool through evaporative cooling. Following water and the fluid exchange between the porous vessels, the seawater containing the rock that was extracted from, the rock containing the rainwater, and then the water being transferred to the permeable clay pot, and then to the body, challenges and muddies fixed distinctions between the nature and culture, technology, and the body. The presence of the destiladera in the Caribbean homes, in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, registers the long residue of colonial water routes, sedimented through a domestic piece of furniture. Here we can see the comments of a Facebook post in which people from different places across the Atlantic are talking about the different names that object has in their own countries. Carried along circuits forged by Spanish imperialist expansion and migration, the vessel has been a testament to sociocultural exchange and transatlantic kinship among island geographies. Flash forward almost 1 century later. In 1952, the arid regions of the US were also facing potential water scarcity. The extremely rapidly growing population of Los Angeles and San Diego, and the Colorado River's asphyxiation and control through continuous dams required a backup plan to provide the region with water. In light of this situation, the US government founded the Office of Saline Water to research techniques for water desalination that would quench Southern California's thirst. This had two clear benefits. First, turning seawater into a new resource arose as a new operative solution to an ongoing problem. And we can see there in the ad published by Westinghouse in the text that it says there, how the ocean is turned into an inexhaustible resource of water. And second, in contrast to land water, salt water from the ocean would be detached from social, cultural, and ecological conflicts and disputes of terrestrial hydraulic systems. So desalination, in the words of Eric Swingedow, was supposed to provide the ultimate hydrosocial fix. In this context, the US government developed a program of 5 major desalination demonstration plants in different arid regions of the US, in Texas, New Mexico, in North Carolina, South Dakota, and Point Loma in California. The one here in California was developed by Westinghouse Electric Corporation and operated by Burns & Rowe Engineering. Each of these plants would test a different desalination method that was consequent with the environment they were sitting on. But an environmental project is also a political project. And as John F. Kennedy said, desalination was a technology that could provide a military advantage in the Cold War, and its success would lead to the betterment of mankind. So desalination was not only a technological development, but as Christopher Lowe asserts, desalination was also technopolitical. This technology, with the goal of providing water to the arid regions of the US, was soon militarized. In February 1964, in the height of the Cold War, Fidel Castro cut the water supply to the US Navy base in Guantanamo Bay. In the absence of any terrestrial water resources, once again, the US turned to seawater as the plausible answer. So to solve this issue, President Lyndon Johnson ordered that the test plant built just 2 years earlier in Point Loma, California, be dismantled and sent all the way to Guantanamo Bay. This would ensure and demonstrate to the eyes of the world that the United States was independent from Cuban water. So they dismantled the plant and floated it all the way down to Cuba. So like an island within an island, the US Navy base was, at least from the standpoint of terrestrial water resources, self-sufficient and could, quote unquote, let the world know that the United States was not receiving water from communist Cuba. A signpost with the words, US answer to Castro, Gitmo water liberated from Cuba at this point, and a series of chains around the small hole in the ground memorialized the ghost pipe that now stood for physical and ideological disconnection. In this hole, there was the pipe connecting the Cuban water to US water in the Navy base. But the disassembled desalination plant was not the only thing that floated abroad. During the Cold War, Western capital, technology, and expertise flowed from the United States to Spain. Under the 1953 Pact of Madrid, Franco's anti-communist regime secured American military and economic support, which helped jumpstart a wave of infrastructural modernization. Also in the early 60s, Franco searched for the economic aperture of the country and integration into the global capitalist model, which aligned with the United States' political and technological interests at the time. So in Lanzarote, these policies materialized in the form of US-backed technology. And we can see here in the previous slide how the three desalination plants, the one in Point Loma, the one in Guantanamo, and the one in Lanzarote are listed one after the other. So this marked the first urban desalination plant using military-developed infrastructure for civilian use. This way, addressing Lanzarote's water scarcity would enable the US to field test and refine the technology, furthering its global research and geopolitical agenda under private stakeholders. The domestication of water, physically and conceptually, would also enable the tourist boom under Franco's regime to thrive, turning the hostile volcanic landscape into an attraction with the quote-unquote infinite access to the liquid. The same year that the naval base in Guantanamo declared its water independence from Cuba, the first desalination plant in Europe was being shipped to the Canary Islands, also manufactured by Westinghouse Co. and installed and funded by Burns & Rowe, who had operated the Point Loma plant and the Guantanamo plant after that. The island received the gift of American technology to alleviate local water scarcity, while in turn becoming a test site, a model. Whereas water filtering devices like destiladeras flowed westward from the Canary Islands to Cuba, now water purification technology flowed in the other direction, but this time with a completely different scale or ambition. When the compactness of the island reads as completeness, replication becomes seductively simple. Borrowing the title of Cuban poet Antonio Benítez Rojo, The Repeating Island, this scalable model of water modernization is, quoting Anna Singh, oblivious to the indeterminacies of the encounter. It would take new routes in island geographies across the globe, given its reduced scale and bounded territory. By definition, an island is surrounded by water in its periphery, which now, abstracted from its context, would ensure its frictionless replicability. The water imaginary in Lanzarote shifted its perspective from the land to the sea. In the words of Swingedau, seawater became an integral part of the formation of a new techno-natural endeavor. So similar to Christ's sculpture 100 years earlier, which floated to the shores of the island and ended the water drought, the miracle of the desalination plant arrived, brought by the ocean, to quench the island's thirst once again. And both of their arrivals, received with a mixture of faith and skepticism, were eagerly celebrated by people and crystallized into architecture. While the arrival of the first floating object in the 19th century was materialized into the construction of the Church of Guatiza, the new infrastructure also welcomed its architectural counterpart as the carrier of modernity to the barren island. So what we see in this image here is an ad by the Westinghouse Corporation. Perhaps not surprisingly, the cover design illustrated by Thomas Rudy for the Westinghouse Engineer magazine in November 1965 showed a water desalination plant. We can assume it's the one at Point Loma, California, looking at the west, at the sunset, over the Pacific Ocean, overlooking the infinitude of the golden resource. As it is described in the front matter of the journal, it says, the concept of pure water from unlimited supply of the ocean using a flash evaporator plant against the backdrop of a sea. That's how they described it. So ocean water would become ready for human use, presumed to bypass the political, legal, and social conflicts of terrestrial water. From the east to the west, the appropriation of natural resources and their transformation into commodified resources for exploitation did not stop at the shore. Once it appropriated the quote-unquote inexhaustible resource, it could relentlessly expand overseas. In contrast, Westinghouse ad for the new desalination plant in the Canary Islands depicted the expansion of modernization back into the land. If the aerial view of the magazine cover exerted implicit domination over the vast body of water, the viewpoint of the new desalination plant looks back to the land from the ocean itself. The first-person perspective, where the plant arrived from, this time looks towards the land, the new territory to be modernized. This project, in which I argue design played an essential role, manifests itself through the fluid and entangled roles of infrastructure, images, and architecture. The domestication of the ocean by means of pipes and images brought modern water to Lanzarote. The term modern water, coined by Jamie Linton, refers to water that has become universalized as a singular element, H2O, abstracted from its cultural, ecological, social, and political dimensions to make it easier to manage. Much like Westinghouse Corporation ads designed by graphic designer Paul Rand helped digest the technological project into the consumer's homes by means of design, the image played a crucial role in this modernization process for locals and foreigners alike. For context, Rand was hired at Westinghouse by architect and designer Elliot Noyce, who famously said, "Good design is good business." In this case, the design of images and buildings alike became a key instrument in staging the island's modernization. So, coincident with the arrival of the desalination plant, the ocean was domesticated and was turned into another product to be sold and consumed as an attraction for tourists, but also quite literally ingested. Tamed, filtered, and channeled into pipes, its rough nature was turned into a docile commodity. With the arrival of the new technology, the island turned to the ocean as the panacea, an inexhaustible resource of fresh water and tourism. Certainly, the changing image of water moved in sync with the changing image of architecture. The promise of technological innovation extended from the building's skin to its guts. The new building straddled between the white vernacular architecture and Western modernism. The exterior appearance of this new piece of infrastructure was not dissimilar to the photographs of the buildings existing in the islands by Pachico Rojas Fariña that he had photographed just a few years earlier. However, the new machine-like white boxes had perfectly smooth surfaces, large windows, and sharp edges, displaying the first glimpses of the incipient rationalism on the island. Most importantly, the true modern feature was a bundle of tentacles and pipes that would channel the interior of the ocean into the interior of the lime-plastered houses. Ubiquitous though hidden, the city was completely transformed to accommodate the circulation of desalinated water under its roads and pavements. Both vernacular buildings and newly constructed modernist units of the desalination plant were immediately transformed into, in the words of Mark Wigley, a fitting in a world of pipes, both at the service of the true and invisible element of modernization, the domestication of water. The commodification of water promised to turn the island into a place not so different from Yves Klein and Claude Parent's drawing climate control of space made just a few years earlier. A hidden entanglement of pipes providing the necessary resources to live, but also that would turn the barren volcanic island into an oasis for tourists. The island could this way retain its untouched appearance in the name of authenticity that would attract and satiate the tourist thirst for the authentic. Meanwhile, the physical and political tentacles connecting buildings with the ocean and beyond would make sure that they would have enough water. And just as a side anecdote, the local newspaper published a letter that same year to Franco's Ministry of Tourism, who visited the island that same year, that said, and I quote, "And you will also see how here it is possible to turn slag into an oasis and the sea into a fountain." And it did, perhaps all too well. The oceanic drinking fountain fed hotel pools and empty glasses, golf courts and agricultural fields alike. It simultaneously fed narratives of leisure and excess, pleasure and need, However, it was never enough for tourism that consumes 46% of the island's fresh water today. The arrival of the new hydric infrastructure carried with it new ways of knowing and relating to water. Water became abstracted from the specific ecological, cultural, and social settings that gave it meaning. As seen both in the multi-flash desalination plant imported from Point Loma and the new piping system laid under the island of Lanzarote, water became a linear, isolated commodity. The abstraction of this new mode of relating to water was perfectly captured in Kennedy's 1961 discourse on the activation of the water desalination plant in Freeport, Texas. From the Oval Office, he pressed a black button on a polished mirror stand. This button was supposed to release the desalinated water that would flow inside the pipes to the outside, for this miracle to be finally visually witnessed and documented. You can see here the photographers documenting that miracle behind the tap. On no account was Kennedy able to see the water live, for the water was encased in pipes, and he was not there at the plant. The technological abstraction of the liquid is reflected in his remote position and in the chrome materiality of the device. After pressing it, he said off camera, "I hope it worked," laughingly, essentially demonstrating this disembodied relationship to water. It did not, or so it said John Carley, who was running the Freeport desalination plant. And I quote, "The button was connected to absolutely nothing." The technological disconnection, a consequence more than a symbol, perfectly captured the disconnection triggered by the disembodied technological mediation. Only 4 years later, in 1965, the company of the desalination plant in Lanzarote announced out loud to the residents of Arrecife, "You can now open your taps," marking the point at which ocean water made an appearance in the interior of the Lanzarotean home, like the black button with the move of a hand. The new technology embodied the promise of human emancipation through the domination of nature, transferred from Californian to Canarian shores. While this techno-fix quenched the island's thirst, it also abstracted and severed Lanzarote's long-standing social and ecological relationship with water. Communal practices like the maintenance of the maretas or the seasonal cleaning of family aljibes, once essential rituals in anticipation of the rainfall, were relinquished, displacing responsibility onto technical experts. The grounded, fragmentary, and partial perspectives of Lanzarote's residents gave way to the totalizing vision of the control panel in the hope of modern abundance. In this new paradigm, water management was reframed as a frictionless diagram. It was operated from the disembodied vantage point of the control panel, as seen here. Dashboards, as Shannon Mattern notes, translate perception into performance and epistemology into ontology. But how are the cultural practices measured, or how are situated and partial epistemologies rendered visible on a panel? The experience of modern water shifted its medium and meaning, relying on instruments of visualization and technical mediation that present themselves as neutral. Interestingly, as she points out, the term dashboard originated as the board or leather apron at the front of the carriage that kept mud from splashing into the vehicle. So, quoting Irene Claver, "Despite modern attempts to limit water into submission, water resists linear simplification. It leaks, overflows, erodes, spreads, disappears, dilutes, and pollutes." Following Shannon Mattern's reflection on the dashboard as a tool of abstraction and control, one might ask, what is this newly arrived technology leaving out? This sanitation implicit in the technological mediation inevitably generates surplus, leaks, floods, discharges, toxicity, waste. These categories demand the construction of a boundary between what is acceptable and what is not, which is culturally constructed and materialized under the guise of technological neutrality. In the case of water desalination and all the technosocial apparatus it brought with it, this resulted in the sanitation on two levels: the exclusion of disturbance and the reconceptualization of the error. Salt was removed from the water and turned the liquid into a commodifiable resource. While water was desirable and pure, safe, marketable, salt, along other organic and inorganic matter, was now deemed impure. A close reading of the Office of Sailing Waters' first annual report of the demonstration plant in Point Loma, California, can also illustrate this point. Tagged under the category of problems, photographs of silt, salt, algae, and other matter accumulating at intake vents illustrated the surplus that the infrastructure sought to streamline. They appeared accumulated in homogeneous viscous piles of water and sediments, accompanied by other limp and organic materials, where liquid and solid matter is almost indistinguishable, harder to quantify and to categorize. The physical exclusion of this disturbance is clearly reflected also in the visual representation. A further dive into the graphic medium of the report reveals a stark contrast between the abstracted representation of water in tables, flowcharts, and graphs, and the clumsy ad hoc depictions of surplus matter. For example, here in this drawing that they included in that desalination, in that report, we can see all the features of the fish at the bottom right. We can see also the apparent roughened materiality of the one smooth intake pipe in contact with salt water. And we can see other elements there. This contrast highlights how such excess resists abstract diagrammatization and demands alternative representational techniques. In Lanzarote, the tourist boom sparked the blooming of unauthorized water and brine dumps all along the coast, where, not surprisingly, new ecologies are also growing, oblivious to legal categories or cultural distinctions between purity and excess. The new desalination technology in Lanzarote that brought the exclusion of the mud from outside in also brought the imperviousness from inside out. The crisp lines of the diagram materialized into hidden pipes that resisted permeability and exchange. And so did the new conception of water it brought along. For instance, between Lanzarote and the neighboring island of La Graciosa, there is a strait called El Rio, the river. By no means does it carry fresh water, but it was given that name because of the water flowing between the shores of the two islands that we can see here in this very old map. And perhaps ironically, fresh water circulates in the river, but perpendicular to its flow, through an underwater pipeline that connects Lanzarote with La Graciosa and provides the smaller one with the liquid. In 2023, the channel between the two islands leaked for the ninth time. The images show a pipe completely corroded by salt and water, with its once smooth surface now completely taken over by submarine life, the same excess that it once removed from within its liquid matter. The water from the ocean was extracted, purified, channeled, and injected back within the same body of water. The leak shows yet another disruption in the supply of the dependent island and another opportunity for both waters to reunite again. As David Hockney once titled his work here in LA, and Andres Hacke later echoed, different kinds of water pouring into a swimming pool, reflects the complex relationships between the island and its waters. Brine from illicit dumps, fresh water from fractured pipes, personal stories, and transoceanic relationships, each resist a singular narrative, spilling beyond the island's shores. So, just to briefly note on this other part of the research. So this was the first part of the research that I've been carrying out during the last weeks here. And I wanted to also illustrate that through a series of drawings as well that are a representation of water infrastructures that shape and are shaped by how we relate to water. So they're a representation of vernacular water infrastructures in the island of Lanzarote. There are infrastructures that acted as mediators between the social, ecological, and cultural context and the liquid itself. But while they were embodying the rhythms of the water and the seasonality and the temporality as well, they alone were not sufficient to guarantee a steady flow of water for the population without its technological counterpart. So the drawings are here presented as incomplete and partial representations, especially through the abstraction of modern water represented through a line. But here the lines are multiplied and repeated and like unruly. So here are just a few photos of the drawings that were also made, not like they were made with a sort of pen plotter. So it was not only made manually or just digitally with the immediacy of the digital. So they were like 3D scan water infrastructures through the lens of someone there. So that also reflected like not only their time availability, like the precision, the access to the different infrastructures. So what I was also trying to do here was like to avoid the conflation of technology and like an objective vision. So like these 3D models were transferred and reworked online and transformed into drawings, and then they were physically they were transformed into physically plotted drawings that were not immediately plotted, but made with the help of this pen plotting machine after like a lot of trials and errors as well. Um, but also, great part of the idea of the drawing was to not use like a top-down view, but the drawing were passed along different hands, and that also enabled a sort of collaboration that in which I could also learn from like the different lenses. The different lenses from the people that had worked with the drawings or the 3D models or the scans or the different machines, um, from these people that were very generous to share their time, their expertise, and their availability as well. So here are like there's like a few images of the drawings of these four water vernacular water infrastructures in Lanzarote. Mm, Thank you.
Well, it's been just a pleasure to see your presentation, but also to speak and get to know the project over the week. And thank you to everybody for being here, for coming. And it's we're going to spend maybe like 5 more minutes on another series of slides, but I promise to be brief, and then we'll open it up to a more informal conversation. So I wanted to start with a few remarks because it was really just also wonderful to hear, to have the invitation from Maeve and from the MAK Center to be part of tonight's discussion. And one of the things that Pablo may have mentioned was that, oh, we'd love for you to respond, Anna, because some time ago you have published work on the infrastructural monument, which was the Stalin's water infrastructure, a hydraulic works between Moscow and Leningrad at the time. And it's a project that I haven't thought about probably in 15 years. But I thought, okay, this is kind of an amazing conflagration of events, let's say, because there are certain parallels in the work that you're doing and the ways in which we were thinking when we were just kind of coming to LA and becoming and starting a new practice here, that have to do with ways in which we can bring research into design, but also kind of vice versa, use the tools of design to begin to document certain things within the world of research, let's say, like whether it's historical or kind of surface, kind of political, let's say. And I wanted to just kind of make that parallel happen so that some of you who might be unfamiliar with that project can kind of see the references. And in many ways, I think we share many references, though there are a number of years apart. And so hopefully they will bring out some of the themes that I'd really like to touch on today. I wanted to open, though, with a slide unrelated to our work, simply because I wanted to position some of Pablo's work within a kind of found object realm, something, that maybe would be called the ready-made by Duchamp, but in this case, this is a work by Cyprien Gaillard. I came across this in the Palais de Tokyo a couple of years ago, and it is a gargoyle, a survivor of the Notre Dame de Reims cathedral fire from 1914, when the Germans were shelling the city. The cathedral, which had been renovated by Viollet-le-Duc in the 19th century, was still scaffolded, and the scaffolding caught fire, and the fire made the kind of roof leak, and the leaking led. Of course, we know the gargoyle is not only a kind of ornamental device on the cathedral, it is also a hydraulic infrastructure. It is literally the downspout that brings the water down from the roof of the building onto the plaza. And so all of a sudden, instead of water, lead was leaking through the gutters and through the mouth of the gargoyle, literally producing a reflux effect on the built environment. So it was just an amazing thing to see Gaillard take this out of the context and bring it into the museum. And I think that in some ways, as architects, we're always fascinated by these artifacts and try to understand how do they first appear to us as abstractions. Like, we come across this image, it is absolutely stunning, but at the same time, there's so much more that we can talk about. We can talk about the war, the scaffolds, the reconstruction, Violet's work, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those things come through when we begin to read the wall text and things like that. And so to come back to some of the things that we were doing when just kind of like came to this city of LA over 15 years ago, it was also a work on water. And so in some ways, one of the questions that I was trying to ask back then was perhaps to quote the constructivist Vladimir Tatlin, who said, "I see sky as concrete material." I wanted to understand how we see things that are intangible, sky, water, flows, things that are out of the reach of normative kind of like representations of an architect, how to see things like that as concrete material. And I think in many ways you do that. And we do that through a kind of means of representation, like making present again those things that seem to be really fleeting and outside of our visual field of reference. And so what you see here is the landfill, sadly a landfill. So sorry to the environment, but back then I had no idea what to do with the foam. But this is a landfill of foam blocks that each one, it represents a kind of block of water as it kind of begins to dissipate throughout the landscape. What it was, and actually my friend John May couldn't be here today. We were supposed to do this together, but Zainab will recognize the back of his head. Yes, but back when he was still allowed to just like military shape his head. We, as I was kind of like putting together this exhibit, he visited one day just to support and literally support, these little blocks up in midair. But one thing that, of course, and this is kind of the projection, right? The interest in trying to understand the figure ground of the image of water against something that becomes monumental. And this is something that we call the infrastructural monument, thinking about how infrastructure becomes actually monumental, how we begin to recognize a kind of rapport with the definition of a monument as something that is both like present and visible, but also incorporating certain aspects of memory and, a kind of understanding of pointing at something else that is not present. So this was a map that I had drawn and, tried to figure out how to place it within the context of a gallery. And all of this to say, Zain and I were driving over here from SciArc. We're in the middle of teaching graduate thesis. In 2 weeks, we invite everybody to come through SciArc. We're going to have reviews, beautiful exhibition of student work. And in some ways, I wanted to mention that, of course, this was a continuation of a thesis project that had begun at the GSD. For you, Pablo, you were not working on a thesis at the GSD because it was an MArch 2 degree, but I feel like your work here has really become a thesis. And in that sense, it's really like an incredible feat to be able to both recognize how the kind of certain kind of like questions that we encounter quite a bit in academia can actually translate into a professional field, but also in a kind of pedagogical mode. And I think that in some ways this was one of those moments, at least for me, and a kind of moment that meant quite a bit. Now, behind all of this, and this is just to kind of like, let's just like drop the bomb here. Obviously, this canal was built by the Gulag. So this is Stalin's kind of waterworks. But somewhat also importantly, and this is every second person working here perished, was basically killed by the labor, by the weather, by the conditions. But among those who were working were also not only the laborers who were kind of digging, pouring, and installing, but there were also, of course, musicians, photographers, writers. And so my own interest in abstraction comes from a moment that was a kind of revolutionary pre-Stalinist moment. But of course, every single one of these artists ended up inside of one of these locks on the canal. This is Alexander Rodchenko's photographs. He was asked, forced, what have you, to work within this context, to document and to bring his own abstract eye to a kind of propaganda machine that would bring through the construction of the canal an understanding of the politics of water, literally how water would travel through the canal and into everyone's faucets. Every time you open the faucet, you would think the name of Stalin. Of course, at the same time, we would also be able to understand it through a kind of architectural representation of those rooms, because a canal or desalination water plant, these are architectures in the landscape, right? They're rooms, they're machines, they're constantly reframing the way that the landscape is working and the ecology all around it. And once this is filled with water, it becomes invisible, because the canal is a water stair and all of those stairs become basically invisible. So to make those things visible, we have to kind of rewind to a place before the canal is operable or operational, and we have to recognize that there's a kind of documentation that takes place on the construction site, so that the construction itself becomes something that is glorified, let's say, or like monumentalized. And of course, architects, this is a political concern, right? We both love these pictures and completely are embarrassed by them at the same time. In any case, when we begin to translate these kinds of things into machines, and I want to talk about automation and the kind of drawing machines that you're using, this was translated from the figure ground kind of images into wire cutter drawings. So there were projections in foam, things that we linked to axonometry and to the work of Lisitsky, but perhaps more importantly, to the work also of Viktor Shklovsky, who wrote, just during the time of the revolution, that the kind of work of art and the technique of art is to make the stone feel stonier, make the water feel waterier, like make certain things feel more than they are in our everyday experience, which is to say there's a kind of making things more extreme, and that extreme nature allows us to be shocked back into reality in some form. We can use different terms, estrangement, остранение in Russian, defamiliarization. Those terms, of course, have been around for quite some time, but in architectural representation, this is something that really dominates the way in which we work. And that question of politics, where to find it, and what's excluded from the way in which we draw, the way in which we work, will become quite important. But it has everything to do with formalism and the kind of starting point for that work. Okay, so I'll conclude us trying to hold down the fort. Anyways, infrastructural monument. Okay, so I'll end with this image. I started with Gaillard, obviously already made another one, the original, the OG, by Marcel Duchamp, which is the fountain. It's another type of gargoyle. And I wanted to bring attention again to the thought that was like so beautifully kind of presented, which is that water is really a multiscalar, that you talk about landscapes, buildings, and bodies. And I wanted to come back to the idea of the body. And of course, this is the urinal turned upside down, made dried out urinal, let's say. The body is no longer doing what it's supposed to be doing. When confronted with something like this, we're supposed to now walk around it, around its pedestal, and admire its kind of sculptural composition. And so I guess that kind of opens up a lot of questions. What do we do with the politics of the site, the economics of the site, with water as concrete material, with the kinds of models or digital models that you're starting to develop into drawings, and some of those kind of beautiful artifacts and how they tell or do not tell the full story, and how that becomes, I think, a publication, hopefully, and maybe we can talk about that as well. So I'll stop here with some of the slides, but I'd love for us to switch seats again, because Pablo, I think you should have your slides on the TV so that we can reference them again. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I have multiple kind of points that we can touch on. The first one, I think, perhaps the drawings. Why not? Could we talk about the drawings first? I'd like to ask you what's included and what's excluded in the drawings, how they stand alone or how they illustrate some of the research that you're doing. And also, I think for some in the audience who are not like architects, we have a kind of broader audience today, it might be interesting also to understand the technicality of the process, in which case you could simply kind of walk us through perhaps the pen, the kind of relationship with the CNC and some of the translations that you had to work through. Okay.
Yeah. First, thanks for presenting the work, and yeah, I think that was fantastic to see. And yeah, in terms of the drawings, they're representations of vernacular water infrastructures in the island of Lanzarote, which was one of the things that drew me initially to this project. So in a way, these were like pre-modern water infrastructures that existed there, and I was drawn to the permeability of these infrastructures. So in a way, they would not necessarily channel and encase the water, but would engage with the water to like address in one way or the other water scarcity in Lanzarote. And that was in a way the germ of the project as well, because what is depicted here, and let me see if I can go. Yes. So there are 4 drawings here. So the first one of the drawings is an aljibe, which is like a water infrastructure that just collects water, essentially. So it was like every family would have one of these aljibes, and so you'd have to like there were like these collective maintenance rituals, like year by year before the rain season. There would be like the maintenance of the aljibe, replastering it, like cleaning it, and they would sort of embody the rhythms of the water in a way. So then the other one is La Jeria, which is part of like the volcanic landscape there, and it uses the tiny volcanic rocks and the porosity in that rock to accumulate water. And so that's the only way that they can like cultivate there. So I was very drawn to that part as well, and how they would perform, not only what they are and how they look like, but also how they would perform with water, not to encase it, but also to engage with this porosity and with this permeability. So here's the second one. The third one is maretas, which were these huge circular constructions that would also accumulate water. But they, for example, the La Gran Mareta de Teguise, which was like a very famous one there, operated for 400 years. And it was collectively built by the inhabitants of the island. And it was collectively maintained as well. So I did not only want to look at them as some sort of way of dealing with water scarcity, but also sort of the organizational tools, the politics, these rituals of maintenance. So that's what drew me to these specific devices as well. But in a way, I did also not want to romanticize these vernacular technologies or only like learn from them, but also like to see them through today. Of course, like as we were talking about earlier, also like these didn't suffice to like quench the thirst of the island as well, and needed the water desalination plant as well. So I wanted to look at them through the lens of today, like also mediated through technology. I was also not able to be there as well, so I was looking at them through the eyes of other people. So I was very interested in sort of merging these two aspects, not only like this very analog aspect of dealing with permeability and water, but also like this other very technological aspect as well, and how like to just spark a conversation of how to move forward as well. So the whole process of doing these drawings was someone went there on site, like through a series of places we selected, and 3D scan, like taking like a lot of photos of these water infrastructure. Some parts have like less definition, less accuracy to the real life infrastructure, but that was part of it as well. And then these 3D models were transferred, and I worked with them digitally, but I didn't want to just plot them, like the immediacy of like working with them on the screen and then having the result immediately plotted. So I don't have a video here, but I have the photo. Maybe it helps illustrate also this process of how to achieve a result that was almost handmade but technologically mediated as well. So that's why the drawings were not plotted, but were like drawn using this pen plotter tool. And so there was a lot of trial and error as well in the whole process. So it sort of slowed down the process of making the drawings as well. So because for this I had to be in conversation, of course, with other people, and the drawings acted as like the mediators as well of these conversations, which helped me a lot in the project as well, but also slowed down the whole process, which I thought it was like a very interesting part as well of not having them immediately plotted.
I think it's important that you talk about process, because when we think about a drawing, quite often we think of it spatially as the outcome, and it's a kind of frozen moment.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, because you're constructing the drawing with a pen tool, it really takes time, which is to say there is a kind of beginning and end to the line. There is a kind of vector of intensity. There are certain kinds of line weights or types which have dashes embedded in them. The beginning is marked by a very, deep point. The end is marked in some other way. And in a sense, there is a kind of accumulation of ink in this fashion that actually, in some ways, like abstracts from the water flow to the ink flow, abstracts from the geographic scale to the drawing scale. And so I want to perhaps ask that question of abstraction, because of course, when we talk about abstraction, there is a kind of also beauty associated with it, because a kind of monomaterial process allows us to understand something as a kind of artifact. But at the same time, there are certain things that are left out. So I'm curious if you have some ideas about the materiality or other types of kind of narratives and myths that we are always, of course, so excited to speak about. How do you read between the lines, in a sense, of your own work to bring back some of that kind of historical, political, economic richness, which, you bring in through the Guantanamo stories and the U.S. kind of JFK stories, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And I think in a way, I think that's a great question. And I keep thinking about it as well. Like when receiving the 3D models and looking at them, like just floating and orbiting in this like endless loop of a GIF or something like that, versus the drawings and like what the different media like represent as well and what they stand for. So in a way, I was trying to sort of understand the drawings not in isolation. I mean, they depict isolated infrastructures, like very precise moments of the island, which in a way I thought it was important to sort of register these moments, because when the water desalination plant arrived, for example, the Gran Mareta, the one I one very similar to the one I depicted there, disappeared and was transformed into just like a plot for building. So it like the very same year, like within a few years span, like the arrival of the new technology derived into the fact that we forgot about these ones. So in a way, there's a process of registering what existed or what's left in the island. But of course, there is a process of abstraction. But I want to think about the drawings as something that is paired also with the research and with the presentation as two parts of the same project, and not as the drawing as something that becomes detached from that presentation, because I think they, in a way, they both nurture each other as well.
I mean, in some ways, you're kind of learning from the landscape and from some of the techniques that precede modernization. And so one could imagine that the contouring of the page is something that can actually happen in that space of geography, that the drawing lands back, like quite literally on the island, so that you can begin to reform, and kind of make present once again certain processes that, in a sense, have been perhaps made kind of obsolete by some of these U.S. kind of modernizing techniques.
Yeah, I think in a way it sort of resurfaces these infrastructures, but in the context of we cannot rely solely on them. So, like, by contextualizing these infrastructures in the whole presentation, sort of what I was trying to do is sort of spark this conversation of what can we learn from this to apply to the future, but not only rely on that as a sort of like way to romanticizing them, but also putting them in context of like today, and like we need both in a way. How do we move forward with the residues of what the other one produced with what's left from these ones? And in a way, that's what I wanted to sort of capture with the drawings, but I think they need both in a way.
We don't have the drawings here.
We don't have the drawings here.
So there's a kind of disembodied, I mean, you talk about disembodied experience. This feels very disembodied. What is your next step for them? And are they drawings to be built? Are they drawings to be looked at? Are they construction drawings? Are they fabrication drawings? Are they documents and illustrations for a text that should be published? Like, what's the role, I guess, of some of these physical artifacts?
Yeah, that's a very good question that I also keep thinking about. And I think it would be fantastic to have the drawings here today physically, but it would just didn't work.
It's too hot and too humid.
To present them here. I've been working on them. I took the photos just to be like, so that they wouldn't be just like floating on the page. But I think it's a very good question of what to do with these drawings and what they represent. And in a way, yes, I think hopefully this can all materialize like in published material in which they can live together, like the drawings can live together with the text or with the images and the presentation. But I think in a way, like I want to look forward, looking at the drawings and project forward. What am I going to do with them? But I think in a way, like the results of the text and the results of the presentation also stemmed from the process of making the drawing. So I think there are like sort of two ways of looking at them. One that is projective, and what am I going to do with these drawings? How do they materialize in like in another format? But also I think like the conversations that these drawings sparked, like with the people, like 3D scanning, that they were on the site and to sort of understand the conditions of the site through their eyes. I think they really like pretty much informed also what's written on the text. So I think there are like sort of two ways to look at these drawings.
It was fascinating to see the image of Kennedy pushing the button, and I kept thinking that there should be an image of Pablo pushing his button. Like you also have a button on this machine that you're like pressing this button, and then all of a sudden, the entire kind of 3D scanned file is kind of put into action, and there is a kind of duration that goes into effect that has to do with all kinds of currents and currencies. And I want to it just kind of yes.
No, I mean I think it's a great comparison, because like the sort of the easiness in which a button is pressed and then the water was discharged in that image. Like I think here I somehow encountered much more friction. Like I don't know how to use this machine at all. So I had to rely on the expertise and time of other people that were willing to help. Also, the machine didn't have the pieces to accommodate the pen. So these pieces needed to be like 3D printed specifically accordingly to the pen. If that was like me in isolation and just pressing a button, I wouldn't have been able to make these drawings.
Well, Kennedy also had problems, right? there was a little bit of friction between him and the desalination plant.
Yeah.
But I guess what you're really encountering is at a smaller scale, at the scale of representation, some of these scaled down processes, like there is an electrical current that is needed to desalinate something. And then there's the water current that's needed. You talked beautifully about that kind of bridge that connects across the Rio and moves the water in different directions. Then, of course, there's a kind of currency of money that it makes the entire kind of island viable for not only those who are already living here, but also for a new tourism to kind of rethink the entire economics of the island. So perhaps we can also talk about kind of a currency in the sense of the present day, a kind of modernity, au courant, like we're kind of coming into this modernization. And in some ways, I think both in the landscape, as you're describing it, on Lanzarote, but also somehow maybe at the GSD or maybe somewhere here at the Art Center, there's a similar currency that has to take place, but at a very small scale, right? There is electricity and there's ink and it's also flowing and there's a kind of coming into the present with some of the drawings that you're presenting.
Mm-hmm. And I think just like thinking about what you said also about like representing the drawing and representing the narrative, like I think that also sort of like sparks a conversation. Like this narrative, like it didn't happen today, but by representing it and putting it in today's context in a way is what makes us feel and rethink a relationship with water in a way. And like, or you were saying that, for example, the project that you did was like 15 years ago, and now you're thinking about this project again and like in a very different sort of context as well, which I think it's might be very interesting, like the way of like representing like older narratives in the current like through the current lens of today. So I think it's a good opportunity to like through the drawings or through the media or through the photos or the text as well, like bring narratives that perhaps were forgotten or perhaps were unrelated completely. So just like taking pieces and putting them together and creating like a new sort of opportunity to rethink these narratives and our relationship to water through these narratives as well. And and I think also, which something that's struck me also a lot was like in the project of the water modernization in Lanzarote, how this was completely hidden but also very visible through images. And I thought there was also like an interesting connection perhaps with the work that you had done as well, like how the images or like how the representation was making that project available to the public, but the scale was completely different, like how the project itself was very visible, like that was one of the purposes, I guess, whereas this one was like underground through the pipes. So I think there was something about that sort of connection between like the different narratives that was also very interesting to think about.
I would love to open things up to some questions. Anybody in the audience who would like to ask Pablo a question, we can kind of make it a little bit more informal.
If time and method of representation is not a limit, would you still have chosen the same medium to represent and to explore your research, or would it have been something, would it look somewhat different?
That's a great question. I think the medium that I would have used would have been still the drawing. And also like as architects, I think it's like one of the tools we have at hand. So like I think the medium will still have been the drawing, but some of the ambition of this project is like also to expand that atlas. And while now they're only like vernacular water infrastructures, I wanted to sort of bring other visions to that atlas as well, in which, for example, uh, like the brine dump and the ecologies that they were creating, they could also be included in this atlas to show that complexity, so that we don't only look at the drawings as one part of the narrative and the presentation as the other part of the narrative, but they could also be, in a way, looking at the issue from all these different angles and representing the issue from all these different angles. So to answer your question, I think the techniques would have been the same, but I think the content would have been expanded to show all these different angles as well. Thank you.
What is form? Is its form work? I mean, I keep thinking you're drawing water, but you're really drawing earth.
Hmm.
Is it true?
That is true. Yes.
I mean, in some ways, it's like the oldest technique in the world, right? I mean, probably 150 years, the contour drawing.
Hmm.
And your contours, they shift from horizontal to vertical, so you kind of updated it into this isometric space.
Hmm.
But I'm curious about that. The water is actually absent in some ways. It's more the land that's actually formed.
Right. Yeah, I think it. I mean, in a
Just
way.
to talk about material.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question, and I mean, in a way, what I was sort of trying to represent was all these different lines of water and how they would engage with that without being necessarily a scientific or accurate representation of that. And for that, I recurred to the technique of the contour lines as a way to represent and making something apparent or visible as well, so that we have this sort of connection with the drawing as well. I think the idea of drawing water would have been like a that can
How
be
do you
also
make it leak? I mean, leakiness is the thesis, I guess. So if you're drawing the formwork and it's kind of the vessel that holds the ink, at what point does the machine kind of produce some of the things that you're describing?
And I think there's a lot of room for exploration as well with the machine, of course, like with the time frame and everything. And I mean, it's the sort of what I was aiming for, but I think there's, of course, like a lot of room for exploration of like, what if the pen is left there for like X time longer, or what if we experiment with that as well? I think it would be like an interesting sort of tangent of the project, or further exploration of the project as well.
Thank you, Pablo, for the presentation, Anna, obviously, for the amazing conversation. I wanted to expand on that a little bit because it seemed as though the thesis is about, in a way, demystifying a modern myth, right? And you're sort of drawing a comparison between your home, island and, of course, the kind of current context here. But then with your drawings, you bring back that mystique by not telling us much about the original.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Anna has started to kind of, she's really trying here to dig deeper, but I think the original is quite unclear to us.
Mm-hmm.
And you describe these vernacular spaces and that we can imagine, but not really visualize. I think it's really interesting to not have that visual comparison so like clearly laid out to us. So that's on the one hand. So that's like point A. And then point B, you also choose, whether intentionally or consciously or not, to kind of keep the mystique of the tool as well. Meaning we understand that there is a world of errors and translations and, both algorithmic and vectorial and other between the sort of mesh and GIF and result of the photogrammetric scan, and then the kind of contour drawing that is, laid out as, Anna was described into these open-ended infinite contours, right? So the contours never really complete themselves. And I'm just curious to hear from you, there is a big world there, a kind of a world that could be described either literally in terms of the sort of technical adventure, let's say, of you began to talk about the 3D printed tips and things like that, that some of us might find interesting and others might find boring. But then there's also another world where you've made very clear decisions about how to translate the image, whether you're working from the actual 3D model kind of directly in its point cloud, or whether you are translating, say, a Make 2D or a image, a rendered view in particular, or whether there's a kind of combination of tracing a found image and tracing and perhaps juxtaposing a 3D model approximation, let's say, that you've received from. And then the other thing is the labor and the kind of the collective effort that you began to talk about, I think is really interesting, but you also kind of keep it at bay. So I'm just curious to hear more about, on the one hand, that space between the two and the desire to not really display the original in the atlas.
I think that's a fascinating question, because I think the original, in a way, I could only present it here through photos, which would be like equally mediated as the drawings as well, or through the floating 3D scan that would be like equally mediated. So the original, in a way, can never be presented here. But I don't know if the like showing a photograph or showing a 3D scan would sort of satisfy that sort of desire to see the original objects as well. And
describe the drawings in a very matter of fact. Like, this is the structural piece.
Yeah.
You describe it, and as though we know what you're talking about. But we're so right.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. I think that kind of that way of describing the abstract work.
No, and I think I thank you for the question, because I think it's fascinating and gives me a lot to think about as well of the project and the future avenues it can take. And thank you. But also, like, I made a very conscious decision in the presentation. It was not stated at the beginning of at the introduction, of like trying to not show like singular images of Lanzarote, which like in a way would sort of like present it as this very flat way of understanding the territory. So I've been trying to, in a way, sort of just show fragments and let us sort of piece these things together to try to present a different narrative of Lanzarote than the one that we are maybe used to, like through means of images, through means of maps, through means of like 3D models or Google Earth. Even when I was describing my position between California and and Lanzarote and the Canary Islands, I was trying to avoid like this top view from Google Earth. So trying to sort of skew the view and navigate so that we could perceive the distance through the ocean in a way, never sort of like understanding it like from above or from afar. So I was trying to make a conscious decision of like not showing everything, especially through the lens of images, because I think that's the narrative we're used to, and that was part of the project, understand the role of images in the understanding of the island. But I think it's gives me also like a lot to think about, and perhaps it came from this sort of decision unconsciously, but it definitely makes me understand like the project as well.
It might not be long enough. Come up.
I guess I'll. Hi. That's all right. I just didn't expect to be up here today. Thank you for sharing your presentation. I think it was really exciting to understand water and I guess the technosocial and ecological kind of framework around water. But I also have a question about this imagery that you had around leaks. Like we saw the leak that the submarine leaks, we saw leaks with the muddied water. I wonder, like in your research project or research process, including that imagery, I wonder if there are any parallels in your own materialization with the drawings or with the 3D models. Like, yeah.
Thank you. And I think it's great that you sort of identified that like the brown water as like a sort of a leak. Like the video or the GIF that was playing in the background is just like where when rain falls and there is no leak actually, in like in the way we understand leaks, but it's just like the water of the rain like mixed with the earth. But I was placing that in the error part of the presentation to sort of like play with that tension between both. And I think not in the final drawings per se. I don't think like there's like an equivalent to the leak. I think there would be like some interesting avenue to explore process with that. But I do think with the, for example, the 3D scans, which we like normally associate with um, an accurate representation of the original. Like the 3D scans, in a way, also register the failures or inaccessibility to some parts of the original, like of the water infrastructures as well. So I think there was like an interesting sort of tension there in understanding that these 3D models are not equivalent to the actual infrastructure, and in dialogue with with the people that did the 3D models as well. Like it was like, oh, I couldn't do this or I couldn't register that because there was a wall and I couldn't access this part. So that's why this one doesn't look as good. And it was like, that's actually quite interesting to see from like me being afar from the place and to register into the 3D model and into the drawing as well. So I think while in the final drawings there's not literal equivalence of the leak, I think throughout the process, not only like like through the process of trying to make the drawing again and again, but also through the capturing of the 3D imagery, like we can sort of start to understand these like perhaps not literal leaks, but how they form like also an integral part of the project.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very fascinating to see all your research. I think I wanted to understand a little bit about the very specific lexicon you're choosing to use in terms of permeability, filtration, and leaking, because I think your thesis title being Permeable Atlas and then some of the focus being on leaking in particular is a different connotation of like intentionality versus something that just happens. And I wanted to understand like how you're defining these terms and if one is more important than the other, whether you're focusing on the leaking more than the permeability, more than the filtration. And I think I just wanted to understand where
Yeah.
you lie within that.
I mean, yeah, thank you. I think that's a great question. And the project stemmed from the interest in the permeability and how we could engage in processes of relating to water over time. Like for example, the hygroscopicity of that little stone or the like of all this infrastructure in a more material sense. So that's why the title of the work as well, A Permeable Atlas. But then like the project like grew and continued expanding, and how this permeability was not only physical or at the microscopical scale, but how it expanded not only in the scope of research, but also like through different continents as well as part of the research process. So I think the precision in the lexicon, I think it does matter a lot, and it reflects like the like where the project stemmed from, which is also like an avenue that I'm very excited to keep exploring also in my design work, and the permeability of these infrastructures that I wanted to like reflect and represent in the drawings. I think that then that sort of permeability, like I was sort of expanding the scope of the work and trying to understand how this could be applicable like across continents, and how to understand like this permeability in terms of relationships of back and forth between continents. So I think in a way the project like started like continued addressing both parallelly, like not perhaps like as a singular narrative, but in the end it materialized through like the analysis of these 7 different stories, 7 different objects.
Just kind of curious of what you have on screen right now. do you plan on displaying that with the drawings once completed? Because at least to me, these are kind of currently reading as the unpure minerals that you mentioned that were being extracted from the water, as these are the unpure minerals, and your drawings, the completed drawings, are the I forgot the word to use, but your pure water. So it'd just be interesting to see both of those displayed together, or if you plan to or don't plan to.
So I wasn't thinking of displaying that like with the drawings. I think that's a very interesting take actually. I wanted to bring it here in the presentation to sort of contextualize the process. I think in terms of the drawings and the future lives they might have, like whether it's in publication or like somewhere else, I was thinking to sort of contextualize it with the text and the rest of the images, because in a way, like my interest, it was more in the sort of social, ecological, and political narrative and contextualizing in that realm rather than focusing on the technical part and the digital part of how to construct the drawings. So just I guess just because of like my interest and scope of work, I was thinking of focusing on the other one rather than this one. Thank you.
Well, perhaps we're coming to the end. If there are other questions, please just raise your hand. I would like to ask, building on your question, where we show this and where we don't. And in some ways, where we do is perhaps in studio in a kind of pedagogical setting. The drawing goes into the background, the process comes to the foreground. And so as you pack your bags over the next couple of weeks to move to Ohio State as the new teaching fellow at OSU, I'm curious, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
But second, I'm curious how some of the research that you've done with the SOM Foundation and MAK Center here, how it becomes not only a publication or an exhibition, but perhaps also a kind of pedagogical pursuit, and how that enters the studio environment.
So, I mean, these questions are questions that I have been interested for a while.
Yeah.
And I was very much interested in the sort of material part of it and how to engage with temporality through understanding of processes of leaking, seeping, sweating. And so this is something I'm very much interested in, and that will definitely keep sort of permeating the studio syllabi as well. But I think there's like one other part that I haven't really explored, which is the techniques. And I think that's also very important to keep in the back of my head to see how both parts can actually like make their way into the pedagogical project as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to everybody. Thanks to the MAK Center, Maeve, SOM Foundation, Pablo, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much.